It was supposed to be a moment of unity, the future of the monarchy standing tall, polished, and unquestioned. But behind the gilded doors of royal planning rooms, something far more explosive was unfolding. Voices were raised, lines were drawn, and at the center of it all stood Princess Anne, unyielding, unflinching, silently preparing to dismantle a role that Camilla had already begun to claim. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it all moved with deceptive calm. Plans for Prince William's future coronation were introduced not as an urgent necessity, but as a quiet, almost ceremonial exercise in foresight, an act of preparation for a monarchy that prided itself on never being caught off guard. Conversations were measured. Documents were drafted with careful neutrality. Every word chosen, every role suggested, carried the weight of centuries. But beneath that calm surface, something subtle had already begun to shift. Because while others treated these discussions as distant and theoretical, Camilla did not. She leaned in. Not aggressively, not openly, but deliberately, positioning herself not as a participant, but as a guide, a presence. Someone whose voice, once peripheral, now carried expectation. It wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. Those closest to the process began to notice the pattern almost immediately. Suggestions that carried her influence. Adjustments that seemed to align with her perspective. A gradual but undeniable expansion of involvement, particularly in areas tied to ceremonial authority and advisory structure. It was framed as continuity, as stability, as a natural extension of her current role. And yet, for those who understood the fragile architecture of royal hierarchy, it felt like something else entirely, something that edged dangerously close to redefining boundaries that had never been meant to move. And then there was the absence. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. Princess Anne was not in the room. Not in the early meetings. Not in the foundational discussions where direction is set before it is ever debated. For some, it was a minor detail. For others, it was a warning. Because Anne was not someone who missed moments like this by accident. Her silence was never passive. It was deliberate, calculated. And as the discussions progressed without her, a tension began to form, not loud, not visible, but heavy enough to be felt in the pauses between decisions. Private memos began to circulate, carefully worded but unmistakably charged. Phrases like traditional authority and modern adaptation appeared more frequently, as if the institution itself was quietly questioning its own identity. It was no longer just about planning a coronation. It was about defining what that coronation would represent. A continuation of established order, or a subtle transformation of it. And within those documents, between the lines and beneath the formal language, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore: there was disagreement. Not open conflict, not yet, but a divergence of vision that threatened to grow into something far more disruptive. Inside the palace, alignment began to fracture. Not publicly, not in ways that could be easily traced, but in quiet conversations. In who supported which proposal. In who chose to remain silent. Some gravitated toward Camilla, seeing her involvement as a stabilizing force, a sign of experienced continuity guiding the next generation. Others hesitated, not out of disloyalty, but out of caution. Because they were waiting for Anne. Waiting for the moment when the one figure known for cutting through uncertainty would finally step forward. Because within the monarchy there are roles that are visible, and roles that are understood. And Anne's role had never required announcement. She was the one who intervened when lines blurred, the one who restored clarity when ambition threatened structure. The silent enforcer, not of individuals but of the institution itself. And even in her absence, her presence was felt pressing against every decision, every assumption, every quiet expansion of influence that dared to move without her acknowledgement. So while the plans continued, and while Camilla's position seemed to strengthen with each passing discussion, an unspoken question began to echo through the corridors of power: what happens when Anne returns? Because everyone knew she would. And when she did, she would not be reacting. She would be responding. And those two things were never the same. But what began as quiet unease would soon erupt into something far more deliberate. Because Princess Anne wasn't just observing, she was preparing to intervene. For decades, she had stayed in the shadows, never chasing the spotlight, never demanding attention. But those who truly understood the monarchy knew one thing. When Princess Anne speaks, the entire institution listens. And now, as whispers of Camilla's expanding influence reached her, Anne wasn't angry. She was calculating, and that made her far more dangerous. Because Anne had never needed noise to assert power. Her authority came from something far older, far heavier than public approval or shifting perception. It came from consistency, from a lifetime of unwavering discipline that had earned her a rare position within the royal structure, not just respected, but trusted in a way few others ever were. She wasn't seen as political. She wasn't seen as strategic. And that was precisely why she was both. Those who underestimated her often realized too late that Anne did not react impulsively. She absorbed, she assessed, and when she acted, it was never without purpose. Her understanding of royal protocol ran deeper than ceremony or tradition. It was instinctive, almost surgical. Where others saw pageantry, Anne saw structure. Where others saw opportunity, she saw consequence. She understood that every role, every title, every subtle shift in influence carried implications that stretched far beyond the present moment. And that was what unsettled her most about what she was hearing. Because this wasn't simply about Camilla stepping forward, it was about how far that step reached into territory that had never been hers to claim. There had been moments before, quiet ones. Instances buried beneath years of royal history where decisions had veered off course, only to be corrected without spectacle. And almost always, Anne had been there. Not in front of cameras, not issuing statements, but present, firm, and immovable. She had redirected outcomes with a single conversation, reframed decisions with a single argument. And those who had witnessed it understood something the public never fully saw. Anne didn't need authority written into documents. She carried it in how others deferred when she chose to speak. But this situation was different. Not because it was louder, but because it was more delicate. Camilla was no longer an outsider finding her place. She was established, embedded. And with that came a complexity Anne could not ignore. This wasn't about rejecting a person, it was about preserving a boundary. A line that once blurred would not easily be restored. And as reports of Camilla's growing involvement in William's future coronation filtered through, Anne began to see a pattern forming. Not chaotic, not reckless, but steady, intentional, and dangerously close to redefining roles that had always been protected by unspoken rules. Yet beneath that clarity there was conflict. Because Anne was not blind to loyalty, she understood what Camilla represented to the current king, what her presence symbolized within the present structure of the monarchy. This was not a decision she could approach without consequence. To challenge Camilla's expanding role was not just to question influence, it was to risk tension at the highest level of the institution. And Anne knew that. She felt it. The weight of choosing between respect for the present and responsibility for the future pressed heavily against every thought, every conclusion she reached. But Anne had never been driven by comfort. She was driven by duty. And duty, in its purest form, was not about preserving relationships, it was about preserving the institution itself. The monarchy was not meant to bend to personal expansion. It was meant to endure. Structured, defined, unshaken by the ambitions, however quiet, of those within it. And if that structure began to shift, even subtly, it was not just a momentary change. It was the beginning of something far more permanent. So she listened. She gathered every detail, every implication, every unspoken intention behind what was unfolding. And slowly, the uncertainty faded, replaced by something far more decisive. Because what once seemed like a gradual evolution now revealed itself as something else entirely. Something that could not be allowed to continue unchecked. And as Anne began connecting the pieces, one realization became impossible to ignore. Camilla's role wasn't just expanding, it was crossing a line. She was never meant to sit at the center of royal power. And yet, over time, Camilla had done exactly that, reshaping perceptions, rewriting expectations, and slowly stepping into spaces once considered untouchable. But what many saw as quiet resilience, Others began to interpret as something far more strategic. And now, her involvement in William's coronation plans would ignite a confrontation no one saw coming. It hadn't happened overnight. There was no single moment where everything changed. No dramatic turning point that marked her arrival into influence. Instead, it was a gradual evolution, subtle, patient, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying close attention. Camilla had entered the royal world under a cloud of scrutiny. Her presence questioned, her position fragile. For years she carried that weight, navigating expectations with careful restraint. But somewhere along the way, that restraint transformed into something else. Something steadier. Something deliberate. She learned the rhythm of the institution, not just its public face, but its inner workings, the quiet negotiations, the unspoken hierarchies, the invisible lines that dictated who held influence and who merely appeared to. And as she learned, she adapted. Slowly, she began to occupy space not just as a companion to power, but as a participant within it. Conversations that once happened around her began to include her. Decisions that once bypassed her began to reflect her input. It wasn't forceful. It didn't need to be. Because the most effective shifts in power rarely announce themselves. Within palace corridors, this transformation did not go unnoticed. Advisors who had once viewed her role as symbolic began to recognize a change. She was no longer simply present, she was engaged. Offering perspectives, asking questions, guiding outcomes in ways that felt natural, even necessary. And with each step forward, the structure adjusted, almost instinctively, to accommodate her presence. Titles remained unchanged, but influence rarely depended on titles alone. It lived in proximity, in trust, in the ability to shape conversations before they became decisions. And yet, beneath that acceptance, there was unease. Not loud, not confrontational, but present. Because for those who understood the monarchy's delicate balance, every shift carried weight. The institution had survived not by resisting change, but by controlling it. And Camilla's rise, while measured, began to feel less like adaptation and more like expansion. A quiet redefinition of boundaries that had once been clearly understood. There was also something deeper driving her. Not ambition in its simplest form, but something far more layered. A need to solidify her place not just in the present but in the future. To ensure that her role was not temporary, not transitional, but embedded into the monarchy's ongoing narrative. And that meant looking ahead, looking to moments that would define the next era. Moments like William's coronation. To her, it likely felt logical. Continuity mattered. Stability mattered. The monarchy thrived on the appearance of seamless transition, of experience guiding evolution. And who better to provide that than someone who had already navigated its complexities from the inside? Her involvement was not presented as control, but as contribution. Not as overreach, but as responsibility. And yet, intention does not always align with perception. Because to others, particularly those who guarded tradition with unwavering clarity, this was something else entirely. It was not just participation, it was positioning. A careful, calculated move toward shaping an event that symbolized not just the future of the monarchy, but its identity. And once that realization began to settle, it became impossible to ignore the implications. If Camilla could influence this moment, what couldn't she influence? Where did the boundary end? Or had it already been crossed? And that was the question that lingered, growing heavier with every quiet decision, every subtle shift in alignment. Because while Camilla moved forward with composed confidence, believing perhaps that her path had already been accepted, there was one presence she had not fully accounted for. One figure who did not respond to gradual change with quiet acceptance. One figure who did not allow lines to blur simply because they had been approached carefully. But while Camilla moved forward with quiet confidence, she underestimated one critical force. Anne had already decided this would not go unchallenged. No cameras. No press. Just a closed room filled with centuries of tradition and one conversation that would alter everything. What happened inside that meeting has never been officially confirmed, but insiders agree on one detail: Princess Anne didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because when she finally spoke, the room didn't just fall silent, it shifted. By the time that meeting was called, the tension had already taken shape. It lingered in the careful phrasing of proposals, in the way certain names were mentioned with increasing confidence, and in the quiet assumption that some decisions had already been accepted before they were ever formally approved. Camilla's proposed role in William's coronation planning was no longer a suggestion drifting through conversation. It had been structured, refined, and placed on the table with the weight of inevitability. Not as a question, but as the next logical step. Those present understood what was at stake, even if no one said it outright. This was not just about participation. It was about definition, about whether the monarchy would continue to operate within the invisible lines that had guided it for generations, or whether those lines would be redrawn in ways that could never be undone. And yet, as the discussion began, the tone remained composed, measured, almost reassuring. Senior advisors spoke with confidence, framing the proposal as progressive, as necessary, as reflective of a modern monarchy adapting to changing expectations. They emphasized unity, continuity, the importance of presenting a cohesive image moving forward. And for a moment it seemed as though the path ahead was already decided. Heads nodded. Agreements formed quietly, without resistance. The argument was persuasive, wrapped in logic that felt difficult to challenge without appearing rigid or outdated. Camilla's involvement was positioned not as an expansion of influence, but as an extension of stability. A bridge between present authority and future leadership. It was presented so seamlessly that questioning it almost felt unnecessary. Almost. Because Anne was there, she hadn't interrupted. Not once. She allowed every point to unfold, every justification to be expressed in full. She listened with a stillness that unsettled those who knew her well, because they understood what that silence meant. It wasn't uncertainty. It wasn't hesitation. It was assessment. She was not reacting to what was being said, she was dissecting it, piece by piece, word by word, searching not for flaws in the argument but for the implications hidden beneath it. And then, when the room had settled into its quiet consensus, she spoke. Not to challenge Camilla directly, not to question intention or loyalty. Instead, she shifted the ground entirely. Her words did not focus on individuals, they focused on structure, on precedent, on what it meant, not just for this moment, but for every moment that would follow if this decision were allowed to stand. She asked a question that cut deeper than disagreement. Not whether Camilla should be involved, but what it would mean if she was. What it would signal about authority, about boundaries, about the very framework that held the monarchy together. It wasn't an attack. That was what made it impossible to dismiss. There was no emotion to counter, no accusation to defend against. Only logic. Precise, controlled, and impossible to ignore. She reframed the entire conversation in a way that stripped it of comfort. Because suddenly, this was no longer about inclusion or adaptation. It was about survival, about whether the monarchy could maintain its identity if its internal lines became negotiable. The shift was immediate. What had moments earlier felt settled, now felt fragile. Advisors who had spoken with certainty hesitated. The same arguments that once sounded convincing now carried uncertainty. Because Anne had done something few could she had changed the question. And once the question changed, the answer was no longer clear. No one rushed to respond. No one attempted to push forward with the same confidence. Because they understood, perhaps for the first time in that room, that this was not a discussion that could be resolved through compromise. Anne had not entered the conversation to adjust the outcome. She had entered to redefine it entirely. And in that moment, something unspoken became undeniable. The decision that once seemed inevitable was now suspended in doubt. Not because it had been rejected outright, but because it could no longer be justified without confronting the consequences Anne had so carefully exposed. And in that moment, the narrative began to unravel. Because Anne wasn't negotiating. She was drawing a boundary. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was absolute. With a single calculated stance, Princess Anne made it clear. Camilla would not shape the future coronation of King William. And just like that, Decades of careful positioning collided with a wall that could not be moved. Because Anne wasn't protecting tradition, she was protecting control. The weight of her decision didn't land all at once. It settled slowly, like a realization no one wanted to fully acknowledge. Just moments earlier, the conversation had still carried the illusion of flexibility, of options still open, of outcomes still negotiable. But Anne's words erased that illusion with precision. There was no room left for interpretation, no space for compromise disguised as adjustment. What she had drawn was not a suggestion, it was a line. And the reasoning behind it was what made it impossible to dismiss. She didn't argue from emotion. She didn't question loyalty or intent. Instead, she anchored her stance in something far more unshakable: constitutional clarity. The monarchy, as she framed it, was not sustained by personalities or evolving preferences. It was sustained by structure, by knowing exactly where authority began and where it ended. And once that clarity was disrupted, even slightly, it was no longer a temporary shift. It became a precedent, a new normal that could not easily be reversed. That was the heart of her argument. Not Camilla as a person, but Camilla as a symbol of something larger. If her role in the coronation expanded beyond its defined boundaries, it would send a message that hierarchy itself was negotiable, that roles could be reshaped based on proximity, influence, or personal evolution. And Anne understood the danger in that. Because once the institution allowed itself to bend in that way, it would not stop. It would continue, quietly, gradually, until the structure that once held it together became something else entirely. For those in the room who had believed this decision was already secured, the shock was immediate. Not because Anne had disagreed, but because of how decisively she had done it. There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the impact. It was as if she had been preparing for this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. And in doing so, she had shifted the balance of power without ever raising her voice. Across from her, Camilla remained composed. But composure did not erase the shift that had just occurred. The space between them, once defined by quiet coexistence, now carried something heavier. Not open conflict, not yet, but something undeniable. A tension rooted not in personality, but in principle. Because this was no longer about shared purpose. It was about opposing visions of how the monarchy should move forward. And within that tension, the institution itself began to adjust. Advisors who had aligned themselves with one direction found themselves reconsidering. Language changed. Proposals were revisited. What had once seemed like a smooth progression now felt uncertain, as if the ground beneath it had subtly but permanently shifted. Anne had not just rejected a role, she had forced a recalibration of the entire process. But the deeper impact of her decision reached beyond the room. Because this was never just about a single event. It was about control, about who defines the future, and who ensures that future remains anchored to the principles that have sustained it. And by stepping in when she did, Anne sent a message that extended far beyond Camilla. She reminded everyone involved that no matter how quietly influence grows, it will always meet resistance if it crosses the wrong line. And that was the part no one could ignore. This wasn't an isolated decision. It was a signal, a shift, a moment that would ripple outward in ways that had yet to fully reveal themselves. Because when control is asserted this clearly, it doesn't end the conversation, it transforms it. But what Anne had set in motion wouldn't remain contained, because outside those walls, whispers were already turning into something much louder. It started as a whisper, just another quiet disagreement behind palace doors. But within days, the story began to leak. And when it did, it wasn't just about protocol anymore. It became a question of power, loyalty, and the very future of the monarchy. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know, why had Princess Anne stepped in, and what did it really mean? At first, it surfaced in fragments, a passing remark from someone close to the process. A carefully worded hint buried inside a larger narrative. Nothing direct, nothing confirmed, but enough to suggest that something significant had shifted behind closed doors. And in an institution built on controlled silence, even the smallest crack has a way of widening faster than anyone expects. Because once a story begins to move, it doesn't ask for permission, it accelerates. Within days, those fragments became threads, and those threads became headlines. Not official statements, not verified accounts, but interpretations. Speculation layered over speculation, each version slightly more dramatic than the last. What had been a private disagreement was now being reframed as something far more explosive, a power struggle at the heart of the monarchy. And the more it was discussed, the more it evolved. Because the public doesn't just consume stories like this, they reshape them. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer controlled by those inside the palace. It belonged to commentators, analysts, and audiences who saw in it something larger than a single decision. They saw tension, division, a clash between tradition and transformation. And at the center of it all, two figures whose silence only made the story louder. Anne, who had drawn the line, and Camilla, who had yet to respond. Public opinion fractured almost instantly. There were those who viewed Anne's move as necessary, even overdue, a firm defense of tradition at a time when the monarchy risked becoming too fluid, too adaptable. To them, she was not resisting change but protecting identity. But on the other side, questions began to rise. Was this resistance rooted in principle or in control? Was the monarchy evolving naturally, only to be pulled back by forces unwilling to let go of the past? And as those questions circulated, they began to take on a life of their own. Royal commentators stepped in, dissecting every angle, every implication. They spoke of precedent, of hierarchy, of the delicate balance that defines royal power. But even in their analysis, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, because what had happened did not fit neatly into a single narrative. It wasn't just about tradition versus modernity. It was about something more complex, something that suggested deeper tensions had been building long before this moment ever surfaced. And then there was Camilla's silence. No denial, no clarification, no attempt to reshape the narrative forming around her. And that silence became its own story. Some interpreted it as restraint, others as strategy. But either way, it left a space that others were more than willing to fill. Because in the absence of a voice, assumptions grow louder. And with each passing day, that silence began to carry more weight than any statement ever could. Inside the palace, the pressure intensified. Because while the outside world debated, questioned, and speculated, those within the institution understood the real risk. It wasn't the disagreement itself, it was the perception of division. The monarchy had always relied on the image of unity, carefully maintained, carefully protected. And now, that image was beginning to crack under the weight of a story no one had intended to reach this point. What had once been contained within a single room had now expanded beyond control. It had become something larger, something unpredictable. And with every headline, every analysis, every opinion, the situation grew more complicated. Because once a narrative like this escapes into the public, it doesn't settle, it escalates. But behind the headlines and speculation, a more personal tension was quietly intensifying, one that could no longer be ignored. No public statements, no visible confrontation. And yet, the distance between them was undeniable. What had once been a carefully maintained balance now felt fractured. Every glance, every absence, every carefully chosen word carried weight. Because this wasn't just about a coronation anymore, it was about respect, legacy, and the invisible lines that had finally been crossed. What made it so powerful was not what was said, but what wasn't. There were no direct exchanges, no sharp words that could be quoted or analyzed. Instead, the shift revealed itself in subtleties, in moments where presence was expected but quietly withdrawn, in interactions that once carried ease but now felt measured, deliberate, almost cautious. Those who had spent years observing the inner workings of the monarchy understood this language well. Because within that world, silence is never empty, it is filled with meaning. Anne did not soften. That much was clear. Her position, once established, remained immovable. She did not revisit it publicly. She did not attempt to justify it beyond the reasoning she had already laid out. And in that unwavering stance, there was a kind of quiet finality. Not hostility, not aggression, but certainty. She had drawn the line, and for her, that line was not open to interpretation. It was fixed. And that made it impossible for the situation to simply fade away. Camilla, on the other hand, responded differently. not with confrontation, but with restraint. A composure that to some appeared unshaken. To others, it felt strategic. She did not step forward to challenge Anne's decision, nor did she retreat entirely. Instead, she remained present carefully, deliberately holding her position without forcing the issue into open conflict. And in doing so, she created a tension that was far more complex than a simple disagreement. Because this was no longer about winning or losing, it was about endurance, about who would hold their ground without breaking the fragile balance that still remained. For those within the palace, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that were difficult to ignore. Conversations became more cautious, alignments more subtle. There was no open division, no visible fracture, but there was a growing awareness that something fundamental had changed. The ease that once defined internal interactions had been replaced by a kind of controlled discomfort. As if everyone understood that they were moving carefully through a situation that could not be openly addressed, yet could not be dismissed either. At the heart of it all was a deeper emotional weight that neither side could fully escape. For Anne, this was about duty, about protecting an institution she had dedicated her life to preserving. But duty does not exist without cost. Because in drawing that line, she had inevitably created distance, not just professionally, but personally. And for someone who valued loyalty as deeply as she did, that cost was not insignificant. For Camilla, the weight was different. It was quieter, but no less significant. She had spent years navigating her place within the monarchy, earning acceptance step by step. And now, at a moment where her influence seemed most secure, she found herself facing a boundary she could not easily cross. Not because she lacked the will, but because the opposition she faced was not emotional. It was structural. And that made it far more difficult to challenge. The monarchy itself felt the strain. Not in a way that could be publicly acknowledged, but in the subtle shifts that signaled something deeper beneath the surface. Unity, once assumed, now required effort. Balance, once natural, now demanded careful maintenance. And with each passing moment, it became clearer that this was not a temporary disruption. It was a turning point. Because when two forces within an institution hold their ground like this, the outcome is never simple. It doesn't resolve quickly. It doesn't fade quietly. It builds. Slowly. Quietly. Until something gives, or something changes. And as the tension deepened, one question began to dominate every conversation. Where did William stand in all of this? At the center of it all stood the future king, watching, listening, and weighing every move. This was supposed to be his moment, his future, his reign. But now, it had become something else entirely. A test. A decision. A defining line that would shape not just his coronation, but the kind of monarch he would become. William had never been unaware of the complexities surrounding him. He had grown within them, shaped by them, prepared for them in ways few could truly understand. But this was different. This wasn't a distant challenge or a theoretical responsibility waiting somewhere in the future. This was immediate, personal, and unavoidably tied to the people closest to him. On one side stood Anne, unyielding, precise, representing the unwavering structure of the monarchy. On the other stood Camilla, composed, enduring, representing continuity through adaptation. And in between them stood William, not as an observer, but as the one whose future was being defined by their conflict. The pressure was immense, though rarely expressed openly. There were no direct demands placed on him, no one asking him to choose in words. But the expectation lingered in every conversation, in every pause that followed when his name was mentioned. Because this was not a situation where silence could last forever. Eventually, his position would have to become clear not through declaration, but through alignment. Through the decisions he allowed to stand and the ones he quietly redirected. What made it more difficult was the weight of what each side represented. Anne was not simply defending tradition, she was defending the framework that had sustained the monarchy through generations. To stand with her meant reinforcing that structure, ensuring that the institution remained defined, stable, and resistant to gradual erosion. But Camilla's position carried its own logic. Her presence symbolized resilience, adaptation, the monarchy's ability to evolve without collapsing under its own rigidity. To dismiss her entirely risked appearing inflexible, disconnected from the realities of a changing world. And William understood both. That was the problem. He saw the strength in Anne's certainty, but he also recognized the subtle necessity behind Camilla's perspective. This was not a question of right or wrong. It was a question of direction, of what kind of monarchy he intended to lead, and more importantly, what kind of leader he was willing to become in order to lead it. So he listened. Carefully. Quietly. He spoke with advisors whose loyalty lay not with individuals, but with the institution itself. He weighed their insights, not just for what they said, but for what they implied. He revisited conversations, replayed arguments, examined the consequences that stretched far beyond the present moment. Because this was not about resolving a disagreement, it was about setting a precedent that would define how future conflicts would be handled. And slowly, a realization began to take shape. Neutrality was not protection. It was delay. And delay, in a situation like this, only allowed uncertainty to grow. If he remained silent, the tension would not disappear, it would deepen. It would spread into other areas, into other decisions, until the lack of clarity itself became a problem too large to ignore. That realization changed everything. Because for the first time, William began to see this not as a conflict he needed to navigate, but as a moment he needed to define. A moment where hesitation would not preserve unity, it would weaken it. And in that understanding, something shifted within him. The careful balance he had maintained began to give way to something more decisive, not impulsive, not reactive, but firm, intentional. This was no longer just about managing relationships or maintaining appearances. It was about leadership, about stepping into a role that required not just understanding complexity, but acting within it. And as that clarity settled in, William began to move not visibly, not dramatically, but with purpose. Each decision, each alignment, each quiet choice began to form a pattern, one that would eventually reveal where he truly stood. Because in the end, a monarch is not defined by the conflicts they avoid, but by the ones they confront. And this was his first real test. Not of power, but of identity. Not of authority, but of direction. And as William began to make his choice, the monarchy stood on the edge of something far greater than a disagreement. It was a transformation. This was never just about a coronation. It was about control, identity, and the future of an institution built on centuries of unspoken rules. And in one decisive moment, Princess Anne had done something few ever dared. She had reshaped the balance of power without ever stepping into the spotlight. But the real question remains: what happens next? What Anne set into motion did not end with a single decision. It extended outward, quietly but forcefully, into the deeper mechanics of royal governance. Because when a boundary is reinforced this firmly, it doesn't simply resolve a moment, it redefines the structure around it. The monarchy, long accustomed to evolving through subtle adjustments, now found itself pulled back towards something more rigid, more defined. The flexibility that had allowed certain roles to expand was suddenly met with resistance, as if the institution itself had been reminded of the importance of knowing exactly where its lines were drawn. That shift carried consequences. Not loud, not immediate, but lasting. Discussions became more cautious, proposals more measured. The unspoken understanding that certain boundaries could be approached, perhaps even stretched, had been replaced by a renewed awareness that some lines were not meant to move at all. And at the center of that recalibration stood Anne's decision, not as an isolated act, but as a signal that the old structure still held authority over the new. For Camilla, the impact was undeniable. Her role had not disappeared, but it had changed, refined, contained. What once seemed like a natural progression of influence had been redirected into something more defined, more limited. And while she remained an important figure within the monarchy, the trajectory she had been following no longer extended in the same way. It was not a public defeat. It was something quieter, more complex, a reshaping of position that would influence how she moved forward from that moment on. For William, the effect was even more profound. Because this was no longer just a situation he had observed, it was one that had shaped him. The choices he made, the stance he allowed to solidify, the direction he subtly endorsed, all of it became part of his emerging identity as a future king. He had been forced to confront the reality that leadership within the monarchy was not about avoiding tension, but about defining it, about deciding which principles would remain untouched and which could evolve. And in doing so, he stepped closer to becoming the kind of monarch the institution would ultimately depend on. But beyond the walls of the palace, something else was happening. The public, once distanced from the inner workings of royal decision-making, had caught a glimpse of something rarely seen. Not scandal, not chaos, but complexity. The monarchy was no longer just a symbol of stability, it was revealed, even if briefly, as an institution navigating its own internal struggles. And that revelation changed perception. For some, it reinforced respect. For others, it raised new questions. Because once the illusion of effortless unity is disrupted, it is never fully restored in the same way. And yet, despite everything that had unfolded, a deeper uncertainty remained. Because while this moment had been defined, it had not closed the door on what came next. The tension had not disappeared, it had been contained, redirected, waiting beneath the surface, where unresolved dynamics often linger. And within an institution as complex as the monarchy, those dynamics rarely stay quiet forever. That is what made this moment so significant. Not just because of what it resolved, but because of what it revealed. Power within the monarchy is never static. It shifts. It adapts. It challenges itself in ways that are rarely visible until a moment like this forces it into the open. And when that happens, the outcome is never final, it is simply the beginning of a new balance. One that will eventually be tested again. Because in the world of royalty, power never disappears, it simply waits for the next moment to rise again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.